Brown had a split personality. One personality loved me to the bone, while the other was hopelessly obsessed with my stepbrother Brad. Every time he switched, I couldn't bear to watch him suffer. I would personally deliver him straight into Brad's arms. But this time, he stayed at Brad's for half a month, far longer than ever before. I couldn't help but go looking for him, only to catch him with his arm wrapped tightly around Brad, gloating. Does that idiot brother of yours actually believe I have a split personality? If it weren't to help you fight for the inheritance, why would I ever be with him? Playing along this whole time has been absolutely disgusting. You really need to make it up to me, baby. Main text. The night breeze was cool, and the balcony was bathed in soft, milky moonlight. Elliot leaned against the railing, a warm orange ember glowing from the cigarette between his fingers. Soft footsteps approached from behind, and a warm body pressed against his back. Brown's arms wrapped tightly around Elliot's waist. He buried his face deep into the fragile nape of Elliot's neck, his voice laced with a soft grievance. "Honey, why didn't you come looking for me? I almost couldn't make it back." Elliot's jawline instantly tightened, the muscles beneath his pale skin twitching slightly. He didn't say a word. Met with silence, Brown nuzzled into his chest from the side like an eager puppy. He tilted up his innocent face and gently plucked the cigarette from Elliot's lips. "Honey, stop smoking. It's bad for you." Elliot forced a smile that held zero warmth. He pushed the man away and turned toward the living room, stepping onto the thick cashmere rug. Brown trailed closely behind him into the warm light, crouching obediently by the sofa. He carefully tugged at Elliot's sleeve. "What's wrong, honey? Are you mad I came back late?" The other personality was so overpowering. "I had to struggle so hard to break out and find you." Seeing Elliot cast his gaze downward, ignoring him, Brown scrambled onto the sofa, throwing his entire body over Elliot's chest. His shoulders hitched with every sob. Warm tears quickly soaked through Elliot's high-quality shirt. Elliot looked down, his long fingers wrapping in reverse around Brown's trembling hand. He smiled and shook his head. "I'm not mad." Brown let out a long sigh of relief. He tilted his head up and left a soft kiss on Elliot's cheek. "I knew Elliot was the best." Elliot stared at him, the corners of his mouth ticking up. Mad? All of his anger had already burned to ashes the night before. Because this time, Brown had stayed at Brad's for half a month without returning. Elliot had decided to go find him. He had just parked outside Brad's villa when he saw Brown and Brad strolling under the warm glow of the streetlights. Brown had his arm wrapped tightly around Brad's waist, the two of them looking incredibly intimate. Caught up in the conversation, Brown laughed until he doubled over, mocking with reckless abandon. "Does that idiot actually believe I have a split personality? I think Hez the one who's sick. If it weren't to help you fight for the inheritance, why would I ever be with him?" With that, he lowered his head and kissed Brad deeply. "This whole time has been absolutely disgusting. You really need to make it up to me, baby." Brad's cheeks instantly flushed. He smiled and tightened his grip around that waist. The two embraced as they walked through the door, bathed in a warm amber halo. The temperature inside the car plummeted to freezing. Elliot slowly rolled down the window, his eyes locked on that door leaking warm light. He lit a cigarette, the flame reflecting in his dead, unblinking eyes. He didn't even flinch when the cigarette burned down to the end, the searing ash blistering his knuckles into red, swollen welts. According to Brown, he was orphaned at a young age and suffered from schizophrenia. When he saw Elliot at the bar, the innocent main personality fell in love with him, while the passionate alter ego fancied Brad. Elliot had once suspected it was a lie, but with every switch, Brown truly seemed like a different person. That was until the day Brown held a knife to his own neck, sobbing and screaming that he had to go to Brad. And Elliot, time and time again under the glaring white lights of the hospital, had poured his heart and soul into finding a cure for this poor patient. What a sweet, ruthless lie. Elliot's initial impulse to tear them both apart dissolved into a chilling calmness after weighing his options. After all, his father had long secretly designated his brilliant adoptive brother Arnold as the true heir of the Mellon family. The more effort these people bet on him, the harder they would crash from this sweet dream. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the Maybach's privacy glass, scattering soft, fractured gold into the cabin. Elliot leaned back against the leather seat and took the dossier from his assistant. "Young master, The situation at the psychiatric hospital is fully under control. Elliot kept his eyes lowered, giving a faint hum of acknowledgement. As his fingertips brushed over the pages, a cold, silvery frost seemed to dance along the edges of the paper. Inside the hospital's spacious, well-lit office, the morning sun cast a cozy warmth over the solid wood desk. But the moment Elliot stepped into that warm light with his men, the head doctor's face drained to a dead, ashen gray. Elliot didn't say a single word. He simply walked over and sat down in the leather chair opposite the desk. He lifted his heavy eyelids, his gaze sweeping across the room like a razor blade. The warm air around them instantly froze. In less than 2 minutes, the doctor was trembling like a leaf in the autumn wind, fine beads of cold sweat dotting his forehead. It was a wealthy lady who paid me. She told me to fake the split personality diagnosis report. A wealthy lady? Elliot narrowed his long, sharp eyes. His slender fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk. Tap, tap. In the dead silence of the room, the crisp sound felt like a countdown to doom. A frail figure, bedridden for years, violently crashed into his mind. His stepmother, Ariel. The woman who, ever since she walked through the door with 3-year-old Brad, had wrapped him and his adoptive brother in a sugar-coated shell of meticulous maternal love. Over a decade of daily pampering, a care even gentler than a biological mother's, weaving an enormous, heartwarming web. Who could have guessed that behind this ultimate tenderness hid a venom-laced blade, paving the way for her own son to seize power? Elliot leaned forward slightly, blocking the last ray of sunlight on the desk, and plunging the doctor's face completely into shadow. "You'd better take what happened today to your grave." He lowered his voice, his tone as soft as a whisper, yet carrying a suffocating chill. The assistant silently gathered the evidence. Elliot pushed open his front door. The afternoon sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, outlining his tall, slender frame with a soft, golden halo. His phone screen glowed faintly. On the surveillance feed, Brown was standing in the cashmere-carpeted study. Like an anxious cat, he was expertly scouring the gaps between the bookshelves. The classified documents had long been securely locked away. Brown dropped his hands in frustration, the unwilling curve of his lips glaringly obvious through the high-definition lens. Elliot curled his lips into an incredibly gentle smile and stepped into the quiet air. Hearing the noise, Brown immediately came out of the study, faking that reassuring warmth. "Honey, you're finally home. I made your favorite soup." Elliot's eyes crinkled in a smile, though ice was freezing over in their depths. He closed the door softly and placed a brand new white pill bottle on the clear glass coffee table with a crisp clack. "The doctor changed your prescription. Don't take the old ones anymore." Elliot crossed his hands, his gaze resting like a gentle spring breeze on Brown's suddenly stiff jawline. "It's been so long and you haven't gotten better. From now on, I'll personally supervise your medication." The smile on that pretty face shattered inch by inch like glass. The old pills had been fake, but the ones Elliot brought back were real. Dinner concluded in a cozy atmosphere. Elliot leaned back lazily against the leather sofa, watching Brown clear the dishes. The soup was good. Brown's spine instantly stiffened. When he turned around, his smile looked weaker than a cry. He leaned in, trying to please him. "Honey, I'm already better. These pills are too bitter. I can't swallow them." Elliot said nothing. He just stood up gracefully, took a bottle of milk from the fridge, and slid it, along with the pill bottle, toward those slightly trembling hands. Brown looked at the pills, then at Elliot's calm, gentle face. He suddenly twisted the cap off, tilted his long, fragile neck back, and swallowed the pill raw, his Adam's apple bobbing with difficulty. Watching this, Elliot leaned back into the soft sofa, his chest beginning to vibrate uncontrollably. He laughed out loud, laughing until crystal tears spilled from the corners of his eyes, flashing dazzlingly under the refraction of the crystal chandelier. The laughter made Brown's skin crawl. He took a cautious half-step forward. "Honey, what's wrong with you?" The laughter abruptly stopped. Every trace of warmth vanished from Elliot's face, the silver frost in his eyes instantly turning to sharp ice. "Brown, I am very disappointed in you." Brown's face turned paper white instantly, and he bent over, dry heaving. Elliot suddenly leaned forward, his irresistible presence commanding absolute domination as his long, powerful fingers gripped Brown's chin, locking his head in an upward tilt. Brown struggled frantically. He opened his mouth and bit down hard on the web of Elliot's hand. The metallic taste of rust spread in the air. Elliot winced in pain and tossed him onto the heavy rug. Brown curled up in agony, coughing violently until he finally spat the pill out. Elliot looked down at the crimson beads welling on his hand. He pulled out a soft, wet wipe and wiped it away methodically. "You know everything, don't you?" Brown looked up, his eyes bloodshot, a sickly red flushing the corners of his eyes. Elliot grabbed the first aid kit and gently poured the pungent antiseptic over his wound. His tone was as soft as if he were telling a bedtime story. "Why did you lie to me? Is Brad really that wonderful?" "Of course he is." Brown suddenly let out a neurotic laugh. "For him, whatever I do is worth it." "Good. Very good." Elliot began to clap slowly, the crimson staining his pale skin. He walked toward Brown step by step, crouching down to examine him like a piece of exquisite porcelain. His cold fingers pinched that sharp chin once again. "It's just a pity. I haven't gotten tired of playing with a toy like you yet. I can't return you to him just yet." "What do you mean?" "Elliot, let me go." Elliot's thumb stroked his pale cheek affectionately, his lips curving into a smile that was both cruel and tender. Exactly what it sounds like. The next morning, the rising sun bathed the villa in warmth. Elliot hung up the phone with his father and looked up at the bedroom door on the second floor, secured from the outside with heavy metal. The muffled roars of a trapped beast vaguely echoed from within, but filtered through the thick soundproof walls, they sounded more like a dull lullaby. The Maybach rolled over the tree-lined driveway of the old estate. As soon as he walked in, the dining table under the crystal chandelier exuded a suffocating air of harmony. Brad was sitting there obediently. Seeing Elliot, he timidly shrank his shoulders. His father's brows were tightly knit, and he slammed his porcelain cup onto the table. "You never take anything seriously, always slacking off." "Well, you never taught me how to." Elliot pulled out a chair and sat down lazily, not even lifting his eyelids. Just as his father was turning blue with anger, a tall, upright silhouette walked out from the backlight. The smile on Arnold's lips was flawless, like a descending god. He walked over to Elliot, his large, warm hand naturally landing on the top of Elliot's head, giving it a couple of rubs. Elliot's eyelashes fluttered, a subconscious urge to cling to that tiny bit of warmth rising within him. Years ago, by a sickbed, his father had unhesitatingly handed everything over to Arnold, who shared no blood relation to them. And Arnold had used his sheer prowess to fill the company's deficits. From that moment on, Elliot knew he wasn't even qualified to compete in this cozy family game. "Is Auntie still sick?" Elliot leaned against the exquisitely carved back of the chair, his long legs crossed, his teasing gaze sweeping over Brad. "Yeah, old issues. She hasn't been getting better," Brad replied, as docile as a harmless rabbit. "Not getting better, yet still digging graves behind people's backs?" Elliot scoffed. He pushed away the delicate bone china plate in front of him and stood up. "All right, I'm taking off. Call me when she's dead and ready for the funeral." "What did you just say?" "You ungrateful wretch," his father roared, slamming the table. Elliot was about to turn around and expose Ariel's setup, but his wrist was tightly grabbed by Brad. Brad looked up with that pure, innocent face, but deep in his eyes surged a thick, dark viscosity that ordinary people couldn't detect. "Dad, don't be mad. I'm sure my brother is just joking." Elliot lowered his eyes, looking at the pale fingers gripping his wrist. With a cold sneer, he peeled them off one by one, turned and strode out of that nauseating greenhouse. The scorching sun baked the asphalt. The moment Elliot pulled open the Maybach's door, Brad lunged at him like a shadow, his hands desperately clawing at the edge of the car door, his knuckles white from the exertion. The facade on his face completely tore away. His features twisted darkly together, erupting with a suffocating, crimson mist. Like a viper, he tried to snake his way into the car through the crack in the door. "Elliot, what did you do to Brown?" Elliot sat peacefully into the soft leather seat. He turned his head, his gaze looking at him like a pile of unrecyclable trash. "Don't worry. You'll never see him again." "What?" Brad's voice sharply spiked, piercing the morning tranquility. No wonder you two are a couple. A pair of idiots who can't understand human words. Elliot suddenly yanked the car door back. With a muffled thud, the immense force sent Brad stumbling backward 2 steps. Brad's eyes turned crimson. He lunged forward like a madman, his hands slamming frantically against the bulletproof glass. Elliot, give him back to me. Give him back. Inside the car, Elliot curled his lips, flashing an incredibly soft, healing smile. He didn't spare another glance at the comical performer outside the window and stepped on the gas. The engine let out a low roar. The Maybach tore through the sunlight like a silver blade, speeding away, leaving Brad with nothing but a blast of hot exhaust and fading crimson afterimages scattered on the ground. The afternoon sun was sliced into soft motes of light by the blinds, draping quietly over the leather sofa in the living room. Elliot sank deeply into the soft cushions, like a puppet drained of all its strength. The secured room on the 2nd floor was unnervingly quiet now. He frowned slightly, his pale fingers gripping the armrest. Just as he forced himself to stand, the soft click of a key turning in the lock echoed from the entryway. The door opened. Backlit by the hallway's warm overhead light, Arnold's tall figure appeared where their lines of sight met. His mind went blank for a brief second. Elliot belatedly remembered that it was the spare key he had shoved into Arnold's hands right after moving in. If you're here to lecture me, just leave. Elliot turned around in frustration and fell back onto the sofa. He pulled out his cigarette case, his trembling fingertips knocking out a cigarette which he clamped between his lips. His thumb casually flicked the metal lighter, the eerie blue flame dancing restlessly in midair. Arnold frowned slightly, his long legs stepping into the slightly chilly air of the room. I know everything that happened, Arnold said, his voice steady and gentle, as he placed a stack of documents onto the coffee table. Elliot lit the cigarette, took a deep drag, and tilted his head back, exhaling a cloud of white smoke into the air. He forced a nonchalant smile. And then, are you going to scold me? Arnold, do you think Im's still a 3-year-old kid will listen to you? Arnold didn't argue. He just let out a heavy sigh, pulled out the opposite chair, and sat down. His deep, piercing eyes cut through the smoke, quietly fixing on Elliot. Under the weight of such an unconditionally accepting gaze, Elliot's jaw clamped tight. He turned his head and blew smoke at him as a sign of provocation. Yet Arnold didn't dodge. Instead, those downcast eyelashes fluttered slightly, and the amber halo surrounding him grew infinitely soft. I'm sorry. I failed to protect you. I let them bully you again. With just those words, all of Elliot's sharp defenses instantly crumbled into ruin. His throat felt blocked by a waterlogged sponge. He pulled at his lips, trying to let out a couple of scoffs to maintain his dignity, but an unhealthy, damp flush uncontrollably welled up in his eyes. Without warning, a scalding tear smashed onto the back of his hand, making him shudder. He only wanted a little bit of unreserved favoritism, a bit of warmth that belonged to a family. But all these years besides Arnold, everyone had been scheming against him. Elliot threw his head back, biting his lower lip hard in an attempt to force the tears back. He didn't dare look directly at that warm, amber halo, only managing to feign composure. That's not true. If anything, I'm the one bullying them. Arnold didn't expose his clumsy disguise. Instead, his long fingers tapped gently on the documents and pushed them forward. This is the proof of Ariel and Brown's collusion. You have Brown here, right? I'll take him away today and settle this for you. Elliot stared blankly at the stamped pages, the cigarette ash falling softly from his fingertips. What do you mean? Elliot, it's not as simple as you think. Arnold's gaze suddenly sharpened, but the hand that covered Elliot's wrist was dry and warm. He stared straight into Elliot's eyes, his tone echoing with undeniable certainty. Ariel went through so much trouble to plant Brown by your side. Do you really think it was just for some company secrets? If he perishes here, no one will be able to clear your name. Elliot's pupils violently shrank. His wrist jerked abruptly, crushing the half-smoked cigarette right into his palm. But acting as if he felt no pain, he sprang up from the sofa. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, he sprinted to the 2nd floor like a madman. The once warm light in the hallway now looked like twisted shadows in his eyes. Arnold followed closely behind. In front of Brown's door, Elliot's legs instantly lost all their strength. His knees buckled, nearly sending him to the floor. Even though there were no sharp objects in the room, if someone had truly made up their mind to meet their maker, who could stop them? He couldn't stop trembling, a fine layer of cold sweat seeping out from his pale skin. Just then, a pair of warm, thick hands reached out from behind, gently enveloping his freezing, shaking hands. "Don't be afraid. I won't let anything happen to you," a deep voice sounded by his ear. Elliot swallowed stiffly and finally grasped the cold doorknob. Creak. The moment the door was slowly pushed open, the chill in Elliot's veins completely froze. The dim room was a complete mess. Brown was slumped lifelessly in the corner. A blinding crimson trail snaked down his forehead, crawling past his pale cheek, eventually disappearing into the dark, dried collar of his shirt. He leaned askew like a broken rag doll, motionless. Elliot stood frozen in place, his chest heaving violently, yet forgetting how to exhale. Arnold immediately stepped forward, taking a knee to check Brown's injuries. But Elliot couldn't hear a thing. Cold sweat had thoroughly drenched his fine shirt, sticking to his spine in a cold, clammy mess. That patch of crimson in his line of sight was infinitely magnified, turning into a churning sea of red. Brown was dead. I killed him. Arnold held up his phone, dialing emergency services. His lips were moving. But all that echoed in Elliot's eardrums was his own desperate heartbeat, pounding like a war drum. He wanted to step toward that warm, amber light to grab onto that single lifeline. But just half a step in, the world before his eyes abruptly powered off like an old TV. His legs completely gave out, and he crashed heavily into an abyss of dead silence and darkness. Light and shadows twisted into bizarre, colorful blocks. On the old estate's mahogany sofa, his father's face suddenly turned vicious, his finger practically jabbing into Elliot's eyes. "You ungrateful wretch. How dare you kill someone?" The scene spun wildly. In the overwhelming crimson fog, Brad's eyes were terrifying as he tightly grabbed his collar, roaring, "Why did you kill him?" In the corner, Ariel crossed her arms. Exuding a nauseating dark green toxic mist, she smiled condescendingly. "Elliot, you're finished." On the ground, soaked in crimson, Brown abruptly opened his eyes and locked onto his ankle. "Ah!" With a broken whimper, Elliot sharply gasped, his chest jolting violently. The terrifying illusion before his eyes receded like the tide. What came into view was Arnold's face, etched with anxiety and heartache. Seeing him open his eyes, Arnold's tense jaw finally relaxed, and he let out a long breath. The defenses in Elliot's eyes shattered completely in that instant. Like a stray child who had finally found home, he threw himself into that embrace, filled with a crisp, woody scent and warm body heat. "Arnold, I killed someone. I killed someone." Tears crashed like a broken dam onto Arnold's shoulder. He clutched the high-end suit jacket desperately, his knuckles turning a pitiful, stark white. "What do I do? What should I do?" A broad, warm palm landed on his back, patting him gently, with a soothing rhythm, over and over. That source of warmth flowed down his spine and throughout his body, slowly thawing his freezing limbs. None of that happened. Arnold's chin rested gently on top of his head, his voice softer and firmer than ever before. "Brown didn't perish. Hez still here. I'm here. I'm right here with you." It wasn't until that rich, amber-like halo of warmth completely enveloped him that Elliot's uncontrollably shivering shoulders gradually stilled. Arnold explained that the medical team had worked through the night, and Brown had made it. Elliot's mind was still a tangled mess. He gripped Arnold's suit sleeve tightly, his knuckles white with exertion. "What do we do next?" Arnold turned his hand to cover that freezing hand, his warm palm tightening firmly. "Don't make any rash moves just yet. Pretend as if nothing ever happened." Soon after, Brown was escorted into the study by the bodyguards. Due to the severe trauma, his cheeks were paper white. Elliot looked at him, 1,000 thoughts clogging his throat, yet he couldn't utter a single syllable. The air sank into a deathly silence. After a long while, Arnold's fingertips gently tapped the armrest of the leather sofa. His deep, cold voice broke the silence. "Brown, still want to meet your maker?" Brown kept his head down, his messy, broken bangs covering his eyes. Arnold stood up at a leisurely pace. His towering shadow instantly loomed over Brown on the floor. "Looks like you do." As soon as the words fell, two doctors in white coats stepped forward, pinning Brown's shoulders down tightly from both sides. Brown, who had been acting like a corpse, finally reacted. His pupils sharply contracted, and his entire body erupted into a violent struggle. Arnold looked down at him from above, a very faint sneer curling his lips. "Isn't that a rather strong will to survive?" He raised his hand slightly, and the doctors immediately withdrew the syringes and stepped back. Completely drained of energy, Brown slid down the legs of the chair like a puddle of mud onto the cashmere rug. His chest heaved violently as he croaked out, "What do you want to know?" "You know perfectly well what I want to know." Arnold sat back down, his gaze devoid of any ripples. As Brown's fragmented confession unfolded, Elliot's heart plummeted into an ice cellar. Ariel wasn't just after power. Beneath her gentle smile hid a blade meant for his life. It turned out that Brad and Brown had been together since high school. When Ariel found out, she pushed Brown until he dropped out. But Brad broke ties with Ariel time and time again, just to be with Brown. Left with no choice, Ariel changed her tactics. She used Brad's future as leverage, turning Brown into the most convenient pawn in her hand. Sprawled on the floor, Brown's shoulders twitched slightly. He struggled to lift his head, a single, precarious tear hanging from the corner of his eye. "I never thought you would actually take the bait." I made up the split personality. "I just wanted to openly bounce between you two so Ariel couldn't do anything about it." Elliot fiercely clenched his fists, his nails digging deep into his palms, his chest heaving violently. Absurd. Utterly absurd. Back in that neon-lit bar, the figure swaying clumsily on the dance floor had clearly shown traces of Arnold beneath the shifting lights. He had been so obsessed with finding a substitute for someone far away that he had personally brought this viper into his home. Elliot was so furious that even his breathing began to break. Arnold extended his large, warm palm, steadily supporting Elliot's trembling arm. He didn't look at Elliot. Instead, he drove his gaze like a knife into Brown on the floor. "Would someone who truly loves you ever let you cast your life away?" Hearing this, tears burst from Brown's eyes, washing two trails down his ashen cheeks. He let out a low, bitter laugh. "I suppose you really have to face the end once to finally understand." The bodyguards dragged Brown away like an empty shell. Only the two of them were left in the cavernous study. Elliot stared blankly into the void. Suddenly, he threw his hand back, swinging his arm with full force. Slap. The crisp sound of a slap echoed through the quiet room. Blinding red welts instantly surfaced on his pale cheek. He had been too stupid. He had nearly played himself to doom, and now he was forcing Arnold, who had just returned from abroad, to clean up his colossal mess. Gritting his teeth, he raised his hand to slap himself a second time. His wrist was intercepted mid-air. Arnold didn't speak. He just stared at him deeply. Those eyes, usually as placid as an ancient well, were now surging with unconcealed heartache and dark fury. Elliot sniffled, his nose stinging, and an aggrieved flush quickly rimmed his eyes. "I'm sorry. I caused you trouble." Arnold still remained silent. He reached out with his long, defined fingers, tracing the red, swollen handprint with the rough calluses of his thumb in an extremely restrained manner. The touch was so searing it made Elliot's heart hammer like a drum. "Elliot." Arnold's voice was deep and slightly hoarse, calling his name as he had countless times before, but deep within his gaze lay a heartbreaking layer of disappointment. "You have to understand, as long as it concerns you, I am more than willing. But you absolutely cannot keep messing around like this." After Arnold left, Elliot stayed up all night. In the ashtray next to the leather sofa, burnt cigarette butts lay in a chaotic pile. The long ashes seemed to silently mock his absurd past. Just as a grayish-white rift tore open the horizon, his phone screen glowed eerily, casting a cold blue light over Elliot's bloodshot eyes. Hanging glaringly at the top of the trending list was Star River Group Young Master Elliot Gay. Suspected of murdering partner, there was no solid proof, just malicious speculation and filthy framing. Elliot pulled a cold smile. Ariel was desperate, lashing out like a cornered animal. However, the trending topic only survived for a few dozen seconds before being wiped away by an invisible hand, leaving behind a screen full of page not found. The phone buzzed right on cue. Arnold's deep, slightly hoarse voice came through the receiver. It carried the exhaustion of a sleepless night, yet remained incredibly grounding. "Come downstairs." Elliot pushed open the front door. The distant horizon erupted with brilliant light. The golden morning sun pierced through the swirling morning mist like a sword, spilling directly onto the parked Maybach. Arnold stood tall and upright by the car door. The real sunlight merged perfectly with him, giving his entire being a godlike, inviolable golden halo. He lifted his eyes, his gaze crossing the morning mist to land on Elliot. "Let's go. The show is about to end." The cabin was so quiet you could hear the faint sound of the tires crushing fallen leaves. Sunlight bounced on the walnut center console through the windshield. Sitting in the passenger seat, Elliot nervously twisted the edge of the seatbelt. He turned his head several times to look at the man's sharp, superior jawline. The words reached his lips, but guilt forced them back down. After a long while, Arnold smoothly steered the wheel and broke the silence first. "I'll be heading back tomorrow." "So soon?" Elliot jerked his head around, his pupils dilating as his body involuntarily leaned forward. Arnold kept his eyes on the road, his long fingers resting on the steering wheel. "I came back this time for you. Now that things are settled, I can go back with peace of mind." The air seemed to freeze instantly. For him, Arnold was coordinating a massive business empire overseas, yet because of Elliot's momentary foolishness, he dropped everything and flew back. And just yesterday, Elliot had curled up on the couch like a hedgehog, mocking him with cold sarcasm. Elliot's ears instantly burned. That crimson flush trailed down his neck deep into his collar. He lowered his head in shame, his long eyelashes casting fragile shadows over his eye sockets. "I'm sorry." A soft chuckle escaped Arnold's throat. He turned his head and shot him a glance from the corner of his eye. "I thought you had truly grown up this time, that you could handle things yourself. But I'm very glad you thought of going to the psychiatric hospital for evidence." Elliot completely froze, a gleam of unbelievable light flashing in his eyes. He had always thought that when his father banished Arnold overseas, Arnold had abandoned him too. It turned out that those eyes had always been watching him silently across the ocean. "But in the end, you're too playful and your heart is too soft." Arnold's words were gentle but hit the mark perfectly. Brown had said the exact same thing, and back then, Elliot had been so furious he wanted to rip him apart. But right now, Elliot didn't have the slightest strength to argue back. All he felt was an overwhelming, soul-bearing shame. He took a deep breath, sat up straight, and turned to look at Arnold's side profile against the glaring morning sun. For the first time, his eyes shed their feigned hostility, revealing a resilience like a polished silver-blue gemstone. "I will continue my studies." He enunciated every word, as if taking a blood oath. "I'm done messing around." The cabin sank back into tranquility, but within that silence flowed a vitality akin to a butterfly breaking out of its chrysalis. The Maybach slowly came to a halt in front of the old estate's carved iron gates. Arnold turned off the engine. Instead of getting out immediately, he turned sideways, resting one arm on the steering wheel, and tilted his head to quietly gaze at the young man in the passenger seat. He didn't verbally respond to the promise, but in the warm light and shadows of the morning, a ripple of gratification and inescapable tenderness, slowly, so slowly, blossomed in those eyes, as deep as the night itself. The air in the old estate's living room was twisted into a glaring, dark gray by a fierce argument. Ariel sprang up like she was on a coil, pointing at his father's nose and screeching, "If it weren't for you, you biased old fool, how could I have ever done this?" His father's chest heaved violently with anger. He pointed at Brad, who was shrinking behind Ariel. "Has not my biological son, but when has his food, clothes, or expenses ever been lesser than theirs? How am I biased?" Ariel refused to let it go, her voice shrill as she fired back, "And Arnold isn't your biological son either. What gives you the right to hand such an important overseas project to him? Couldn't you spare one for Brad?" His father fiercely slammed the table, his eyes red as he roared, "He is the son of my comrade in arms. He is my own son. Ariel, you should learn to be satisfied." Just as Ariel was gearing up to continue her tantrum, Arnold walked into the murky chaos, leading Elliot by the hand. Seeing this, Ariel immediately grabbed onto Brad and collapsed onto the floor, sobbing and playing the victim. Arnold didn't even spare a peripheral glance at the farce. He pulled Elliot down onto a mahogany chair. His prominent fingers picked up the blue and white porcelain cup, taking a shallow sip. His deep eyes were as calm as an ancient well. "This tea is quite good." The angry wrinkles at the corners of his father's eyes instantly smoothed out, and he quickly called for the nanny to bring a fresh batch. Arnold slightly turned his head, that gentle amber halo sweeping over Elliot's side profile. "Elliot, do you think it tastes good?" Elliot looked into those smiling eyes and mirrored him, pulling a smile at his father. "Dad, the tea is good." His father gave a cold harumph and looked away, though his jawline softened considerably. Ariel beside them tried to continue her sniffling, but Arnold set down his teacup. The porcelain clinked with a crisp, cold ring. "Dad, I'm leaving tomorrow. When I head back this time, I'm taking Elliot with me." "What?" Elliot and his father spoke in unison, their expressions of shock identical. Arnold let out a low chuckle, his gaze drifting between the two of them. "Aren't you father and son quite in sync?" Elliot coughed awkwardly and shrank back into his chair. Arnold reined in his smile, pointing directly at the mother and son on the floor. "Back to business. Dad, how do you want to handle this? Divorce? Tell her to roll as far away as possible." His father waved his hand violently, his eyes filled with absolute disgust. Arnold gave a slight nod, his long fingers casually twisting the pinky ring on his finger. The bodyguards entered on cue. Genuine terror finally surfaced on Ariel's deathly pale face as she and Brad were forcibly hauled out the door. The next day, 30,000 feet in the air, a sea of clouds churned outside the cabin window. Elliot stared blankly out the window until a large warm palm landed gently on his head. That familiar, reassuring current of warmth poured down his scalp, silently melting away the very last shred of unease in his body. Only then did it truly hit him. He had genuinely been pulled out of that mud pit by Arnold. There was no cold project department waiting for him, only an acceptance letter to an Ivy League university. The dreamlike college life wove through the light and shadows. The sunset's afterglow dyed the basketball court orange as the after-images of Elliot and his blonde teammate crossed over the hardwood. It wasn't until a bead of sweat smashed onto the floorboards that Elliot, clutching the basketball, abruptly stopped in his tracks. Today was his birthday, and Arnold had said he would come pick him up. He rushed frantically toward the school gates. At the edge of his vision, Arnold stood quietly in the twilight, wearing an impeccably tailored black trench coat. That usually gentle amber halo had now condensed into a dark golden storm, compressing the surrounding air to a suffocating density. "You're here." Elliot cautiously approached, his Adam's apple bobbing restlessly. Arnold didn't speak. He simply tilted his cold jawline slightly, signaling him to get in the car. Inside the Maybach, it was so deathly silent that only the low-frequency vibration of the engine remained. Elliot opened his mouth several times, trying to explain, but just as he let out a single syllable, a large warm palm suddenly clamped over his lips. The palm pressed firmly against his soft lips, so searing it made the corners of his mouth go numb. He widened his eyes, his heart pounding wildly. Under this intense domination, a trembling urge blossomed on the tip of his tongue, a desire to peek out and lick that warm trace. The car pulled to a steady halt in front of the villa. Arnold released his hand. As if relieved of a heavy burden, Elliot pushed the car door open to escape, but his wrist was suddenly locked in place by an inescapable, magnetic force. He was yanked back hard. A towering dark shadow instantly swallowed him completely, pinning him firmly against the leather seat. Faint moonlight crawled in through the window, tracing the deeply aggressive contours of Arnold's eyes. His scalding breath struck Elliot's fragile neck without any obstruction. Their chests rubbed fiercely against each other through the thin fabric, and Elliot could clearly feel that wildly drumming, out-of-control heartbeat. "You really are oblivious." The low, hoarse voice crushed against his eardrums. A burning nose brushed suggestively against Elliot's taut jawline. "It's just a new basketball friend I made." Elliot shook his head frantically. A dewy moisture seeped from the slightly reddened corners of his eyes. He tried to push the man's hand away, but he was completely devoid of strength. Turning a deaf ear, Arnold undid the seatbelt buckle with one hand and pressed his body down heavily, thoroughly eliminating the last bit of space between them. He lowered his head and bit fiercely into Elliot's pale collarbone. "Ugh!" Elliot hissed in pain, arching his fragile neck as his 10 fingers dug deeply into the back of Arnold's trench coat. Arnold impatiently loosened his restricting tie and slowly raised his head. He leaned down, pressing his forehead firmly against Elliot's. Those eyes, usually bottomless and unreadable, were now churning with a dark fire that threatened to swallow him whole. "Elliot, I can't hold back anymore," he said through gritted teeth, his voice devastatingly hoarse. "Let me take the position of your boyfriend first, all right?" Elliot tilted his head back, the mist in his eyes finally condensing into crystal tears that rolled down. He raised his trembling arms and wrapped them tightly around that warm neck. His voice was choked with emotion, yet incredibly resolute. "Yes."
That's where the story ends. Elliot is like a hedgehog covered in icy spikes, using rebellion, hostility, and a feigned indifference to mask his extreme lack of security. Faced with the toxic flattery of his vicious stepmother, Ariel, and the relentless pressure from his hypocritical stepbrother, Brad, he forced himself to maintain a cold, unfeeling shell. But underneath it all, he was incredibly soft-hearted and desperate for a family's love. On the surface, Brown might seem a bit pitiful, pushed into dropping out of school by his lover's mother. He later played along with someone he didn't even like, all for his lover's sake. In the end, he was even tricked into nearly meeting his maker by the very man he loved. But he wasn't exactly a good person either. The moment he manipulated Elliot with that fabricated split personality without a shred of guilt, he proved his own despicable nature. Fortunately, a deeply scarred Elliot always had someone by his side who favored him unconditionally, someone who pulled him entirely out of that freezing abyss. Arnold was the ultimate safe haven. He was steady, reserved, and a brilliant mastermind, yet he saved every ounce of his tenderness solely for Elliot. Once the family's dark clouds were swept away, and he finally had Elliot by his side, the always restrained Arnold completely shed his older brother facade. That slightly jealous, dominating bite on the collarbone, coupled with that dangerously hoarse line, "Let me take the position of your boyfriend first," instantly pushed the irresistible magnetism between them to its absolute peak. This kind of love, shifting from extreme restraint to an inescapable explosive passion, is truly enough to make anyone's heart race.